This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
We have begun. So welcome to Engineering and Climate Change. And the purpose of this course is to give you a start on the tools and information needed so that you can make a difference on the challenges this brings. Here's our graphical summary of what we're up to. We are on our fourth lecture of the quarter. We have Don Foldenauer, a real solar industry veteran and expert. I think you'll enjoy him a lot. And we have an ice expert, a polar explorer next week. Ice is really important in climate change, which is why I push that. And if anybody, you don't even have to read the whole thing. If anybody wants to borrow some of my two most precious books, Ice in the Ocean by Peter Wadhams or On Thin Ice by Richard Ellis, you're welcome to them. You will see later in the quarter on the last lecture when I'll describe my own project on ice. I think ice is one of those crucial items in climate change. So Doug is the head of Ice Axe Expeditions. He's been to the North and South Pole more often than anybody else on the planet. So it'll be an interesting talk in its own right. Very inspiring he is, and very into educating people at all ages, you know, grade school on up through your level. But he also places experiments for environmental scientists to help see what the effects of climate change are. And it's very, very relevant to one of the big levers on climate change on the planet. And then the logistics, I think there are actually still a couple new students as people's schedules fluctuate. So we'll put this up again of just what our logistics are. If you have missed any lectures, please make it up by looking at them on the videos. And then, of course, it's best to attend live if you can, right? But if you are remote or if you're making up, please look at those lectures and then please send me a summary. And I would much prefer if you do it to the CourseWorks site. I have gotten some annoyed emails from some of you about the CourseWorks site, and I have collaborated with experts here before the class on what on earth could be going wrong. It takes a little time for the CourseWorks site to load the assignments, but they are there. And most of you are finding it, so I know it works for most. So just give it another minute or two and say it's buffering. And then it also, some people are looking for a Dropbox. And that's not the mode I'm using. It's just under assignments, and you can just cruise down and look for the active assignment. And I'll put the ones for summarizing this lecture and then for the questions for next week up a little later today. So those aren't up there yet, but I should have them up by this evening. And then office hours, if anybody wants to take me up on that, I am always happy to show up before class to meet over lunch if you'd like, often with our speaker. But let me know, so I'm sure to show up. If you need an office hour to contact me any other time, just send me an email there and be happy to get in touch with you. So your homework every week is summarizing the lecture. I am saying by Wednesday. This is generating a lot of stress, I'm noticing. I would prefer you to summarize it by Wednesday because it'll be fresh in your minds. But if you're turning it in later than that, I am not marking you down for that. This is a pass, no pass course. And if you've got a thoughtful summary, you are getting full marks for that. I also would like you to do some reading for the next lecture. What I suggest, or something on your own, just so you're thinking about what the next lecture is, and email me at least one burning question. I've been saying by Sunday, but then by the time they all trickle in, that comes to Monday, and that seems maybe a little late for our lecturers. So if you could actually aim, if we could aim to have most of them in by Friday, at least some preliminary questions, that would be helpful. I could be sending the first wave to our lecturers early on. That would be good. And then for next week, excuse me, I have to talk. Exactly. Yes, I wanted to make sure this was showing up for SCPD students. For next week, I'm going to put up a paper that actually discusses my own project that has come out recently. I have the author's permission to do it on soft geoengineering. But it will allow you to see why I think ice is so darned critical in climate. It discusses a number of interesting options, but this is one of them. And then these optional books, you really are free to carry them around and build your muscles or even read them. On Thin Ice and Ice in the Ocean. Kimberly Weefling, I think we have a scrappy book or two that is floating around the class if anybody wants that. We've got the What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20 floating around the class if anybody's dying to see that. It's a good one. And I will unlock the SGSI 2007 class, the Wednesday readings on climate that you can read on the website as well. It's about time to ask you folks to suggest readings, meetings, lectures. I think I will make that part of next week's homework, is just please suggest something so that we're broadening the knowledge base of the class. And the week after that, be warned, I will be asking, has anybody thought of a research term project? Again, pass, no pressure, but that you would like to dive in a little bit and do a 2-minute presentation on sometime during the last few weeks of class. I think it would add a lot. Information opportunities. The JISEOP meeting last week was fantastic, as it always is, and they're going to put videos up of all of it, I think, at the end of the month. And you who knew that students could go, did you get to go to a lot of? No, okay. Did anybody actually have time to go to it? Okay, great. Okay. And what'd you think?
It was really good.
Yeah, I get amazed by that. The tutorials seem to be getting better and better, and I was blown away, as always. It was good. Coming up soon, this MIT Club of Northern California, you don't have to be MIT affiliated to go, is coming up, the Smart Grid meeting. Those are fun if you've got a car and can get there. And the CleanTech Open, still an open invitation of if anybody wants the discount from Rex Northern to attend. You could get that. That's 2 days of real inspiration. And the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, I'm interested in that one. It happens in San Francisco in a while. So as we've said, entrepreneurs will find opportunities in climate challenges, and Don is one example that we will see of how one does that. Business needs environmentalists, and environmentalists need business. I believe that. From the JISEOP meeting, what solar energy is taking advantage of are these Exergy resources. Exergy is basically, think of it as energy, but in its most useful implementation. So it's not just low energy differential, like a temperature difference of a degree that's very hard to harness. It is more concentrated, harnessable type of energy, and solar radiation, boy, there's one of them, right? So that's what powers the solar industry. And we've got a lot of insolation on the planet. And so this is really what's being harnessed. If you can harness sunlight, you're doing a very good thing for green energy, right? Although it comes down to storage is a lot of it, which we'll get to later in the quarter as well. You'll find a couple battery-oriented talks. So, Don Foldenauer, manufacturing director at Alta Devices, survived Solyndra, which I know some of you have questions about, and started out as a semiconductor person. So very neat background, I think relevant to where a lot of you may be coming from or going to yourselves. And let's give a warm welcome. Thanks for being here.
There we go. So I hope we're on, right? You guys can all hear me, right? Okay, good. So I just wanted to tell you, I spent about 16 to 17 years in the semiconductor industry, and then I went on from there to the renewable energy industry, from hydrogen fuel cells and then into solar. So I spent the last probably 8 years in renewables. I've done design engineering from early in my career all the way to manufacturing, marketing, this sort of thing. And so had a broad background. And one of the fortunate things about the semiconductor industry is that it was so widespread across the globe that I got to go travel around the world and see how people are using energy. I've been passionate about energy since I was a little kid. And so I always wanted to get into solar, but I never thought it was the right time yet for solar until about 8 years ago. And so I've worked in large companies and in startups as well. And so I just wanted to give you a bit of a background so you understand where I'm coming from. And the reason we're talking about PV is because it's got about an 80% cumulative annual growth rate. And so it's hard to find an industry like this. So people say, well, you know, the caveat to this is you're starting at near zero. So if you're starting at zero, your growth rate's going to be enormous. And so, but it's sustainable, and it's a continued growth rate, and it continues to ramp up over time. And I'll show you some numbers of where we think it's going. And it's because, you know, fossil fuels are getting more expensive, and people are demanding more clean energy. The other part is that the PV for photovoltaic, it's been steadily declining in price, because as they continue to put more and more capacity online, you can see that the costs come down. It's the economies of scale kick in. And so what we're seeing is this top line is what's happening with what we call crystal silicon, and I'll talk to you about different types of solar here in a minute. But crystal silicon is on a pretty steady growth, or pretty steady price drop path. And then we see the second line here is thin film, and this is First Solar, one of the largest players in thin film. And so you pretty much have thin film and crystal silicon, the two types of solar. And so if you see that we're on an 80% cumulative annual growth rate, and you see this price reduction, you can see why people are jumping into it. And there's a lot of other reasons, incentives and other things that are driving people there, but it's a pretty good cost reduction curve that we see continuing. This is the different types of solar. So if you look up here in the upper left-hand corner, there's different types of solar cells, multi-junction cells, where they stack multiple solar cells in one. There's these crystal silicon cells where it's a single crystalline cell, one junction. And you can see there's different thin film technologies there in the green. The top is SIGs, which is copper, indium, gallium, diselenide. Cadmium telluride, which is what First Solar is known for. And then amorphous silicon and some other types of. The red here is the emerging PV, and you see it's way down here on the bottom curve. And those are things like dye sensitized. In essence, it's kind of artificial photosynthesis methodologies. So there's some new techniques coming out in that. I don't know a lot about that area because it's up and coming, and it's not something that I pursued. It's a very low-end type of a solar. So, but I know that there's the catalysts that they're looking at are new things in titanium oxide, cobalt oxide, and getting away from manganese as a catalyst. But it's a cheap form of solar. And so it doesn't produce a lot, but it's cheap. So in the end, what we really care about is, everybody would say, well, why don't we go with the highest efficiency up there? And the reason is cost. So in the end, when you're putting solar somewhere, whether you're a power company putting it out in the desert or a homeowner putting it on your rooftop, what you care in the end is cost per watt. That's what you're after. And so in the end, it doesn't matter how efficient the thing is if it costs you a fortune. So, you know, you want the best efficiency for space applications, satellites. So they go with gallium arsenide because it's got the highest. But they're willing to pay a premium for it because it's low weight and high efficiency. But you know, if you're going to build a solar farm out in the desert, all you care about is how much it costs you in the end. How much you're going to produce for how much it's going to cost you. So these are, I lifted this from the NREL website, but it shows all the different types. And it shows the efficiencies are continuing to grow up over time. So if you see that the growth in terms of solar is going up, the costs are coming down, the efficiency is going up, all things are going in the right direction. They haven't leveled off yet. They're still continually climbing. So it tells us that solar is on its way in a good path. So I wanted to show you, in terms of demand, PV demand, this is kind of the market. And you see a large chunk of this, the green area, the green shaded area is mostly Europe. And this over here is Asia and the US. But as you see in 2013, it's shrinking in Europe because, not because the size of Europe's getting smaller, it's because Asia is kicking into gear. So you have to remember that when it comes to PV, you can put it anywhere. You can put it on a rooftop, you can put it on your calculator, right? You can put it just about anywhere. It's not like a nuke plant where you got to build it out in some secluded area and it costs you a fortune. You can put PV anywhere. So the thing about having PV anywhere is that a lot of these places, they don't have a grid. There's no grid. So in the US, you drop in a power plant somewhere, you connect to the grid and you're on your way selling power. But for a lot of these people, they can't even get to a grid. There's places in Africa and India and China where they have no grid yet. So if you're one of these people and you want electricity, one of your choices is wind or solar. So it's really important that what we see now is that Europe is a fantastic power grid, US has a fantastic power grid, and so people were really adopting there. They're still going after that, but now we're really seeing Asia kick into gear. And we're seeing other countries kick into gear in Africa and South America where a PV gives you, a lot of luxuries that most people take for granted. So the tricky thing is that manufacturing, probably closer to 40% was done in the US about 5 to 6 years ago. Now it's closer to 4% in the US. And the reason is that the majority of it has gone to China. And they're making crystal silicon solar. That's the predominant thing that's coming out of China right now in terms of PV. And so as China really kicks into gear, it brought those prices down because you had so much more production coming on board. This is your typical solar panel that everybody sees. You think about solar, this is what you see, a blue panel up on somebody's rooftop. But what you have to remember is that there's a lot of different applications for solar and a lot of different places that they're putting solar. So you can put it on a rooftop like I was telling you about. You can have solar power plants or what we call solar farms out in remote areas. Take a big chunk of land and start dropping in a bunch of solar plants, solar panels on a big array. And so that's what you see up here in the corner. So they put them in the desert, they put them in nice areas, they put them in a lot of different places. I've seen them in Europe along the freeways. They've put them along the Autobahn and things because they're using good land. Instead of turning farmland into solar farms, they're using usable land like freeways and things like this. You see a lot of commercial and public stuff. These are harder to spot because usually there's a parapet around the outside of a building. You don't get to see the actual solar on the roof. A lot of companies are trying to showcase it to say that they're going green. Walmart and Target and these guys are trying to do stuff, Costco. They're all alternative applications. Everything, like I said, from solar tents for soldiers to solar covers for cell phones. You can go on the web now and buy a solar battery charger for your cell phone. They're all different types of things. The calculator, they've had solar calculators since the 70s. So there's a lot of different applications for it. The trick is what kind of efficiencies do you need and what kind of cost per watt do you really need? And that's what drives you kind of in different applications and different types of solar to put in those applications. So there's major solar technology. I talked about the crystal silicon, either monocrystalline or multi. And the thin film, there's amorphous silicon, SIGs, and CAD-TEL. And so these are the typical thin film. And the reason we're talking about thin film is instead of consuming a wafer, the crystal silicon, you take a wafer of silicon and you consume it as part of your solar cell. The thin films, they're able to go to a thinner film and they can put it on glass or stainless steel or aluminum as a backsheet. And so they're doing it, some of it on plastic. So they're getting creative, but it's what you would consider a thin film because here the wafers are in the hundreds of microns. Over there, you're talking a couple of microns of actual solar cell on a thicker backsheet. So crystal silicon is about 90% of the market. That's why when the Chinese kicked into gear on crystal silicon, really dropped the prices significantly for solar across the board. The thin film guys had to come down as well. So if you think about that cost curve, people ask me about Solyndra. It's one of the things that killed a lot of solar startups in the Bay Area here, a lot of solar startups around the world, is because that cost reduction curve was so steep that people just couldn't keep up with it. They said, oh, I can make a profit at this price point. And then the price point changed and they had to change their business model. And so they were chasing this rapidly decreasing price curve. And so a lot of them couldn't keep up. It's one of the issues with Solyndra, but a lot of other issues I'll tell you at the end. Typically when we talk about solar, we're talking about semiconductors. So the same semiconductors you would use in the others. You see silicon here at 14, germanium, but a lot of people are using something, gallium here and arsenide. And so that you take gallium and arsenide and you still end up in the semiconductor range. The CAD-TEL people are using cadmium and telluride. And the SIGs people are using copper, indium, gallium, and selenium. And so they're combining these together in the right ratios to get a good semiconductor, to get what you need from the solar properties. So I was showing this earlier. This is basically your silicon solar construction. So you start with polysilicon, you make an ingot, you slice the ingot into wafers, you take those wafers and you put some metal on them and treat them. You end up with a solar cell. You take a bunch of these solar cells, you put them together into a solar panel. You can see this solar panel. If you look closely, you see all these different dots. The white is the corners of these wafers. The black is where the solar cell is. So if you look up in the corner there, you can see those are all cells. So you put a bunch of cells together into a module, and you put it on your rooftop. And in terms of cost, this is where a lot of the cost is driven from. So the solar cell production is not very much of the cost structure. The majority of it is really putting it on your roof. So if I give you a solar panel, where does the most of the cost goes? It's the installation, it's the inverter system, it's the racking on your rooftop. It's this is where the cost goes. So 50% of it is putting it on your roof, and that number is actually going up because this piece of the value chain is going down, but the roof racking and everything hasn't gone down at the same rate. So roof racking starts around 50%, it's getting higher. So that's for your typical solar, and it doesn't matter whether you're racking it on a roof or you're racking it out on a solar farm in the desert. So in the end, like I told you, it's about solar energy costs. How much does it cost you? So your cost per watt. So how much can you get out of this thing for how much you put into it? So the solar cell operation, just for those of you who are not used to it, basically a light comes in, a photon strikes, an atom separates out an electron-hole pair. The electron goes down the metal path at the top, the hole meets down here, and it comes down through your load and comes back. It's a pretty simple process. It's very simple when you start to think about it. There's a lot of innovative things that people are doing to try and get more out of it. And there's a lot of different papers out there on how to get more out of this. So one of the problems you have is that these the holes can meet up with another electron and basically give out a piece of light, a little bit of a photon, and so you end up with losing that ability to generate electricity. So your goal is to try and make sure that you don't end up with the recombination. And I'll talk about losses here in a second. This is your typical structure. You have your front, your back. The back is a good reflector, so any photons that make it all the way through hit the reflector and come back, you have a chance to catch them on the rebound. You texturize the surface so it's an anti-reflective coating. When you have the light coming in, if it's reflective in any way, that light bounces off. You've lost that ability to generate from that. So you end up with a solid metal typically on the back. On the top, you want these lines, thin lines. So you allow more light to come in so you're not blocking the light. You don't want any shading or shadowing. So typically, you've got this big, thick silicon wafer. 200 microns to me is thick, and then on the top you have a very thin layer of silicon that you've doped in order to make this work. So I was talking about losses. There's a lot of different ways you can lose. You can have reflective losses where the light hits the top metal and bounces off. It can hit the actual solar area and bounce off because of you don't have a good anti-reflective coating. You can end up with recombination losses I was talking about, where an electron-hole pair you created with a photon ends up meeting up with some other electron or hole, and bam, you've got a photon and you have no electricity generated. So there's a lot of light, backlight absorption, so when the light hits, it absorbs instead of reflecting. So there's a lot of things that you want to make sure that when you talk about a solar cell, how do you get the most efficiency out of it? So the material is very important. That's why I was showing you the different types of materials. Gallium arsenide being one of the better ones, these dye-sensitized ones being the lower ones. And so what I wanted you to understand is that the material can make a lot of difference, but there's a lot of little techniques that you can do in here, a better reflector, a better anti-reflective coating, a lot of different things that help improve the solar cell efficiency. So the solar production by region, I was explaining China. It was really hot in Germany. And the reason it was big in Germany is because a lot of the research was being done in Germany. And so the Germans were really smart about this. They got clever. They put in a feed-in tariff, which made people attracted to solar. And so solar kicked off really high in Germany. And everybody was putting solar on their rooftops because it paid. You actually turned a profit. So people were borrowing money in order to put solar on the roof because they knew that over time they could make money on it. And the banks were lending because they knew that they got a sure return on it. So Germany was one of the big leaders in this with their feed-in tariffs. A lot of others in Europe started to do the same. Spain, Italy, Portugal have all kicked in with solar feed-in tariffs. And it's really spurred a lot of growth in those areas as well. But the production started to go away from Germany. They've got high manufacturing costs, of course. Their labor costs are high, the land is high, everything becomes expensive. And so it started migrating away from Germany and off towards China. And the same thing has happened in the US. So when you talk about funding for solar, there's a lot of different people trying to figure out ways to make the solar more efficient, more cost advantageous. So there's been a lot of venture funding that has gone into solar. So you see solar, the solar itself, the efficiency in terms of smart grid and this sort of thing has been funded a lot. Biofuels and storage are being funded. I took these specifically because they relate to the solar industry. People are still, there's venture funds going after wind and other things, but biomass and things like this. But really, I thought these were more germane to the topic here at hand. The U.S. Treasury Program, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but they're spending a lot of money on solar, as you can see here, the number of projects since its inception in 2009. Some of these programs died on the vine, and it's because they were competing with, China. They couldn't sustain that drop in price, and so they went in with great intentions and a great business plan, but as the market changed, they weren't able to change rapidly enough. So a lot of them died. But a lot of that innovation that was being done at these small startups has been taken by others and is using to foster the entire industry. So in a way, it's helped. So I wanted to talk about innovation. So about a third of all the R&D global funds are spent in the US. Most of the venture funds are really spending it here. The US leads, of course, in R&D. And we've got 200, in 2011, about 400 PV patents have been granted. And about 76% of the PV venture investment has been in North America. So I wanted to tell you this because PV is sort of in its infancy. It's been around since the 1800s. They've known about photovoltaics, but it's really in its infancy and it's taking off now. It's really growing. And so this innovation is really what's kicking in. You see that, efficiency curves are growing and growing. So it's because there's a lot of money being poured into it to get better efficiency programs. So I want to talk to you about a lot of companies that start off, they have to cross something called the valley of death. And the reason we talk about this is you get a lot of venture funding and you can go on the cheap when you're doing R&D. You can do stuff in beakers and test tubes and this kind of stuff. You can do a lot of stuff when it comes to R&D. But at some point you got to get off of R&D and you got to get into putting a production line together. Because at some point you have to make a product to sell. So a lot of these guys, they come in, they get some government investment or industry investment. They work their way over to get some angel investors. They work their way up to venture capital. They're driving their product forward. Everything's a go. And they have to cross that valley of death. And so a lot of people, they don't understand that when you want to build a factory, it's a 2-year thing. So for 2 years, you're spending money on a building, spending money on capital equipment, spending money and you haven't gotten anything back yet. And so that spend, we typically say it's a 3/3. A third of it's the capital equipment, a third of it's the money for the building and land and the infrastructure in the building, and the other third is the burn. Because for 2 years it's going to take you to get from the time you break ground until you're ready to start turning out revenue. It's about 2 years to do this. That's a lot of burn. And so big factories burn at an enormous rate. So you get some great economies of scale with a big factory, but of course it burns like crazy. So a lot of these companies, they try and get through this valley of death and they fail. Because it's really the toughest part. So many great startups out there have died because they couldn't get through the valley of death. So the same thing goes for all these solar startups. They went in and with great intentions, they did great stuff. They're able to do it on the cheap, do a lot of research, analysis. They get to that point where they said, okay, let's go and build a factory. And holy mackerel, they all start dying. And it's because the crossing that valley of death is so difficult. So I want you to understand that because it's not just solar, it's any industry. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you have to build a factory, you're going to be hemorrhaging cash for a while. So raising that money is so difficult. A lot of companies try it with an IPO, or they try it with going out and getting more VC funding, but the VC guys don't want to jump into something that big. So you see a lot of companies that have trouble. They got a great product, great concept, they can't get across that valley of death. So there's a lot of Bay Area PV startups. So Nano Solar is still alive, Mia Soleil is still alive, Daystar is dead. A lot of these companies are dead or dying. And it's because they couldn't get through that valley of death. They couldn't get the manufacturing off the ground. And so, but you see there's so many of them jumping in, and a lot of them you see were jumping into thin film, the SIGs and the amorphous silicon. The guys that jumped into silicon had a unique idea about how they could cut costs of the wafering, make a thinner wafer, this kind of stuff. And so unfortunately, a lot of them, like I said, I don't know, maybe half of these companies are not alive, or they're walking wounded, ready to die soon. So.
Why do you have a question mark at Alta?
It has to do with manufacturing in the U.S. It's not sure where Alta will do their manufacturing. It has to do with, it's cheap to go to Asia and build a manufacturing plant in Asia because the labor is cheaper, the land is cheaper, there's a lot of good subsidies there. But in the end, it's a big leap to go overseas to something. And so there's a lot of question about should we do it in the U.S. and run the risks of higher costs, higher operating expenses, versus going somewhere else where maybe it's a cheaper operating expenses. And so there's a lot of trade-offs there when it comes to manufacturing. So like I said, the manufacturing is the key to any of these companies getting off the ground. It's they can do a lot in the lab. It's when you really, it separates the men from the boys when you have to go to manufacturing. So what was your question?
Is Alta Devices the same company or similar to Alta Energy?
It's a different company. So I work for Alta Devices. So let's see. The challenges I was explaining, the time it takes to get you off the ground, to get through the design phase, selecting the sites, getting through all the negotiations, the state negotiations for incentives, the contractors, all this sort of stuff, getting the construction done, installing all the machines, starting them up, getting them qualified before you can start to ship product. And this time period takes so long that you really have to be prepared to go in and spend this money at an enormous rate with no return for a while. And so if you've got revenue and you're showing a good profit and everything's a go, you can get money to build the next factory or the next factory. But if you haven't built anything, haven't gotten through the manufacturing phase, a lot of people are reluctant to give you money. So there's a lot of reasons why, in the U.S., this manufacturing becomes a real challenge.
So in the semiconductor industry, there are sometimes, multiple users in a foundry to try to get past this. Is there anything like that can happen in the solar industry?
Not so far. It's a good question. In semiconductors, what we have is something called a fabless. We call the factories fabs. And they have a fabless model. So you could design a great chip, and you go to somebody like a TSMC or Global Foundries, and you say, will you build this for me? and they'll take it on and they'll do the manufacturing for you, and you pay them a premium. And so if you do well enough, make enough money, you could do your own manufacturing, or you could stick with the fabless guys. But it helps you get off the ground before you have to go and do something like that. So the fabs are able to do this a little bit differently in semiconductor because of the way you build the chip is very similar. In solar, the volumes are higher, and you know, in semi, you're talking about machines that maybe do 20 units an hour. In solar, you're looking at machines that do 2,000 to 3,000 units an hour. So a huge jump, as well as like I said, there's a lot of different technologies, a lot of different ways they're going. So you couldn't just go to a fab and say, hey, can you build this for me? Because they may not have the right machines, they may not have the right processes, this sort of thing. So it makes it more difficult. So that's why a lot of people are going, they're doing their own manufacturing, and it's very difficult. So I wanted to talk about the supply chain a bit, because about $2 billion of positive contribution so far in trade with China. We've got a real healthy PV supply chain, meaning the machines, the chemicals, this sort of stuff. About 100,000 US jobs in the solar industry in 2011. And this is everything from the guys that put the stuff on the roof to people that maybe work at, I don't know, DuPont or Dow making chemicals for the thing, or you know, people at the gas companies making specialty gases and things. There's a lot of different jobs that you wouldn't think of, but they're in the supply chain. And about 5,000 US companies in the solar value chain. So I was explaining, there's equipment people, they manufacture the equipment. There's materials people, like Dow, DuPont, Matheson. There's a lot of people that do the silicon. REC is a US plant, Wacker is a US plant. These guys are making the actual wafers. And then there's, out here on the cell production and the module production, mostly startups. And so these jobs here are very important to the solar, the solar industry itself. And like I said, it's a huge amount of jobs that are here in the US. Even if some of the production is done overseas, there's still a lot of jobs here in the supply chain. So I wanted to talk about PV jobs, and the majority of these jobs here are in installation. You know, the manufacturing is very small, and it's shrinking. The sales and marketing sales and distribution piece is big. So you understand why this is the way it is, just because there's not a lot of manufacturing. If there were more manufacturing jobs, then you know, the pie would change. But the manufacturing has been going overseas. So the important thing about manufacturing, you know, it's an election year, everybody's talking about jobs, 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 is that manufacturing jobs really generate downstream jobs more than a lot of the others. So, you know, you get to utility jobs, education jobs, they're really important, but they don't generate the downstream jobs like a manufacturing job does. Because if you do manufacturing, you have to have all this supply chain. And so they talk about jobs right now. It's a big topic in the election, but what they're missing is where do the jobs really, we need to be working in all areas, but the manufacturing jobs have disappeared. So it's one of the problems in the US. So when I talk about manufacturing, manufacturing helps supply all these things, equipment, R&D, supply chain, all these things are really important. It helps drive these. So the future global PV mix, I was talking to you earlier about, there's residential capacity has been growing, commercial capacity is growing. These are commercial rooftops. The utility scale is growing. These are utility scales owned by the power companies out in the deserts and stuff. And then off-grid is really an important piece. And this one's growing significantly. The reason it is like I said, there's a huge chunk of the world population who has no access to the grid. They just don't, they have no way to connect. So I know I was in Africa a couple of years ago. The guy asked me if I would take his cell phone to the city and give it to this guy. And he basically, I was going through his village, he gave me a cell phone. Well, then the next thing I knew, 4 or 5 more guys were giving me their cell phones and saying, can you take it to the city? I don't know why they trusted me with their cell phone. But the whole thing was they couldn't charge it where they were at. They had the Wi-Fi network, right? I mean the cell network, but they had no way to charge their batteries. So I had to take it in and give it to this guy who charges all the batteries for these guys. They actually had a guy who has, in a different place, had a battery, a car battery. He lugged around with him. And he would sit down and he would charge your phone for you. And people paid him money to do this because they have no grid. So a guy with a solar cell in his backyard can, charge up all these people's cell phones. It's amazing what they just want a cell phone charger. So off-grid is really growing, and it's in countries you wouldn't think of. You think about South America, there's huge areas of the populace down there that have no access to a grid. China, it's amazing when you go there. There's tons of huge cities, but there's a bunch of people out in the rural areas have no access to grid. India, same sort of thing. India's really got a big problem. They're having tons of brownouts because the power demand is going up higher and higher every day, and they're not able to keep up with your conventional grid connection. So the U.S. energy mix, this is a real important one. I wanted you guys to see from the Lawrence Livermore Labs. You can see that solar is just a real small piece of the pie right now. And when you look at it, this is electricity generation up here. So all these feed into electricity generation. The rest of it is used for other purposes like transportation, industrial, commercial, residential, these types of things. Like residential, you still use petroleum for heating in a lot of places in the Northeast. But this is what the U.S. has done. This is the U.S. And you can get this state by state and understand where it's coming from state by state if you go to the website. The real interesting thing is natural gas is growing rapidly, and it's shrinking coal and petroleum pretty fast. And so there's a lot of people about killing coal jobs in the U.S. The real interesting thing is that they've been building a lot of natural gas plants. There was an article in the paper about Georgia building all these natural gas power plants and turning off their coal plants because it's just, it's dirty. There's a lot of problems with regulation around the areas with coal due to, the dust for kids with asthma and other things, health issues, and just the regulations around it. So they're putting in natural gas. And of course, the fracking thing in the U.S. has turned on a lot of cheap natural gas. It's been dropping amazingly. So if you look at this energy mix, this is for 2010. They've got more updated ones. I wasn't able to grab quickly enough. But you can see it, and you can see it break down by state. So, Washington State, lots of hydropower. West Virginia, lots of coal. So you'll see the different mixes, but this is the U.S. as a whole. And you can see one of the worst things that really kills you, I don't know if you guys have caught it yet, is the upper right-hand corner. It's called rejected energy. That's energy that was produced and wasted. So an example might be the heat in your car is wasted, right? The engine produces a lot of heat, but that heat is just wasted. There's no way to capture that, so that's wasted energy. A lot of the electricity during transmission is radiated, so you don't capture that. So there's a lot of electricity, a lot of power that's just wasted in forms. So if you think about this is an enormous amount of electricity or power. This is all measured in basically BTUs. Enormous amount of energy that's just wasted. So that's why, efficiency is an important piece of this. So I wanted to talk about net generation capacity. The European Union has been adding pretty significantly over the years. You see out here, they were really doing a lot with wind. They were doing a lot with gas to get away from nuke and coal and petroleum. But as you see around 2005, when they kicked in with the feed-in tariffs, Europe took off. This is predominantly Germany's was driving this, but PV took off and it's been growing pretty steadily. And the feed-in tariffs phased out over time. They've been reducing year over year. And so even with the feed-in tariffs going down, people are still installing solar. The Fukushima disaster in Japan with the tsunami a year or so ago, it basically, they started turning off all the nuke plants in Europe. And so by turning those off, they had to drive towards more PV, more wind, other things. So I wanted to show you, Germany is the biggest chunk of this in terms of these countries with the feed-in tariffs. But others are starting to grow. And as you see, as the share of PV electricity production continues to go up and the cost of GDP are going up. You see that the big players are out here, Germany and Italy, but the rest of them are chasing as well. This is an interesting graph. Before solar, this is what it looked like, the average across the day, 24 hours here. There's this huge demand in the middle of the day for, of course, all the people are going to school or going to the industry and they're turning on needing electricity. But this is the perfect time for PV because that's when it works the best, in the middle of the day. And so the summer after solar, this is what it looks like, your average prices. And it has to do with the fact that, you know, solar works perfectly for the peak demand. So there's this big issue when you have a power plant, you want to run it at capacity. Because if you're running it low, it's basically this asset is not being fully utilized. So your goal is to try and make sure that you run it at peak. Well, the problem is that the electricity demand throughout the day changes. So you end up with these giant giant power plants that have to match that peak demand. And then during the rest of the time, they're not matched anymore. The assets sitting there are not usable. So solar actually worked really well because its best time is during the day when the demand is there. And so they're using it to levelize this thing, to take away that peak demand. So now they're not putting in huge power plants that are sitting idle during the day. They've got this solar that works at the right time.
What happens in the converse of that in the winter?
In the winter, what do you mean? In the winter, the demand matches pretty steadily as well.
As well as it does during the summer, so you don't have to install more.
There's a lot of electricity for heat in Europe as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's not like the U.S. very little electricity generation for heat. It's more for gas and oil and this sort of thing. But in Europe, they still use a lot of electricity. And so this is the spot power price, you know, by hour going across the day. And so instead of a former lunchtime peak, there's actually an afternoon trough now. So this is the price of power. So it's really helping in places like that. And so the really interesting thing is Leslie was talking about insolation. It's the measure of how much electricity, you know, how much solar energy is being received in that spot. So when you look at the insolation map of the globe, Germany is actually probably much more closer aligned to the amount of insolation of Alaska than it is to other places. And yet they're the world leader in terms of, you know, installing solar power. And it's because they recognize that even though they don't have the best insulation, they have the best model here for how to drive solar and how to utilize it the best. So they're working out really well for them. So I wanted to show you this. If you watch the blue line, anything up into the upper right of this line shows that you've reached kind of like people talk about grid parity. And it means that the cost of installing solar and the cost of, you know, of solar on the upper right, it actually is paid off now. It's cheaper than, you know, the other forms of electricity in those areas. And so if you see, this is 2010, and the line steps to the left and down. So you pick up Italy and Spain. And as you come across to 2012, Germany, Denmark, Australia start to kick in. And this is because in these places, they don't have cheap electricity or they tax it. Either way, you can either incent somebody to do something or penalize them to do something. Either way, they'll do something, right? They want to get away from it. So Brazil kicks in as you get to 2013, California, Turkey, France. And as you march across, all these things start to kick in. By 2020, you know, you've picked up a lot of these big countries that are big demands. I wanted to talk about solar jobs. So roughly 33 jobs per megawatt for solar. As I talked about that big value chain and all this kind of stuff, a lot of supply, a lot of different people to install and everything. And jobs per megawatt for a nuke, less than 10. So, you know, the difference here is that people talk about, you know, why should we go to solar? There's a lot of reasons to go to solar. There's a lot of reasons to go to renewables. This is one of them because it shows that it pays off eventually. A lot of people are talking about, well, when does it reach grid parity? And I was showing you those slides. There's a lot of places where they don't need grid parity because there is no grid. You know, there's places where Indonesia is a huge population, and they have most of the country is islands, and so on those islands they have a diesel generator that generates this. So they have to pay diesel. So what you're not trying to do is match grid parity. You're trying to do diesel parity, and so you're taking a different model, a different approach. There's places in India where they don't have a grid, and so they use kerosene light yet. And so when you're trying to match this, you're not, for the person who just wants light, You're trying to match kerosene parity, not grid parity, because there is no grid. So when you start thinking about a lot of the world, majority of them out there, don't have access to this grid. When you think about what are you trying to match, it's not grid parity. In the US, grid parity is really difficult to hit. We've got the best grid in the world. We've got cheap power. It's amazing. So trying to chase the grid parity in the US is tough. They're getting better at it. But the solar has so many places it can play and do well at. So this is an interesting one. This was apparently before Steve Jobs passed away here in Palo Alto, Obama came to visit him and they had kind of a forum, a discussion. It's in the Steve Jobs book. And Obama apparently asked him, you know, what would it take to start building iPhones in the US? And he said, the jobs are not coming back. And the reason is once you lose the jobs, it's so much harder to get them to come back. So the point is don't lose the jobs in the first place. I was telling you before, about 40% of all solar panels made in the US. And that was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. Now, less than 4%. And it's crazy. So those jobs went overseas. They're not coming back. So it's hard. It's hard to start producing those jobs back again. So the goal is not to lose them in the first place. So I had some slides. I won't spend a lot of time on it, on recommendations on U.S. policy. I was telling you that you can incent somebody by penalizing them or giving them a reward, right? So it's either the carrot or the stick, and sometimes both work well. And so when you think about the carrot or the stick, if you give them a feed-in tariff, that's the carrot. If you give them penalties in terms of regulations and taxes, it drives them the same. Either way, your people will decide based on their wallet. I kept telling you before, cost per watt, right? That's what people care about. So, kerosene in India, it's like $60 a watt. Diesel, somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 a watt. So I don't have to do much to get to grid parity there. I mean, to get to some kind of parity there. When I can make solar modules that produce electricity, somewhere in the neighborhood now of close to $1 a watt. Maybe some places less than $1 a watt. So if you can do $1 a watt versus $60 a watt, there's a reason why. So a lot of these countries are recognizing this and they're starting to drive policy towards this to try and get these places connected with an off-grid type of a system. So these you can utilize ways to try and drive more investment in solar and more consumption of solar. So to kind of calibrate you to growth, about 15 gigawatts of new solar capacity, but new nuke capacity is about 3 gigawatts. And this is growing more and more, as I showed with the very first slide, which is the 80% cumulative annual growth rate. And so nuke, after the Fukushima disaster and 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, people are starting to get more and more afraid of it. People are more and more afraid of coal and petroleum because you're kind of held hostage by petroleum by any issues in the Middle East. Coal is a dirty process. People are starting to realize the total cost of something is not how much it takes you to buy the coal, but how much it costs you in terms of environmental issues, in terms of health issues, all these other issues. So it's changing the way people are thinking. So some of you guys asked me questions about Solyndra, and I wanted to tell you. Like I said, Solyndra's model started, they were going to be profitable and do well at $4 a watt. And I told you it's now down to $1 a watt. And they chased that curve down, and it was hard for them all the way down. They had a good product, good concept, but they weren't able to make money at the lower levels. They were starting to do the right things. There was innovation. People were doing the right stuff, but they just couldn't get there fast enough. The other thing that kind of hurt them was that the government incentive, the way it was written, forced them to spend at an exorbitant rate to chase this schedule. So they were spending like crazy in order to hit the schedule constantly. They basically said, here's tranches of money based on hitting these milestones. You got to do all this and you get your next chunk of money. Do all this and you get your next chunk of money. And you had to do it on a certain time scale. So it really kind of hurt them. On top of that, it was written, the original loan was written so that, typically in a bankruptcy or something goes wrong, everybody takes their share of investment away with them. So, if I owe you 50%, I owe you 20%. In the end, if the end of a bankruptcy, you get 50% of whatever's left over, you get 20% of whatever's left over. But the government said, no, 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 we want 100%. We want to be made 100% whole before you pay anybody else. Well, that basically hamstrung them. Nobody was willing to invest. They said, why do I want to invest if I know I'm going to get zero out of this, or potential of zero, because you got to pay the government in whole first. So the government wouldn't relent. They wouldn't change the terms of the loan. And so they were starting to really get into closer and closer to the deadline where they were going to run out. And so at the last minute, they went to the government and said, look, you're in for a lot of money, guys. You either jump on board and change these terms of the loan so I can get some more investors and we can make a go of this, or you're going to end up going down and, and we'll sink with you. So the government said, okay, we'll change the terms of the loan. So they changed it, but they changed it too late in the game. And by the time they changed it, they didn't get enough time to get the venture funding to keep going. And so it's really a sad case because I spent a lot of time building the factory, getting it going, getting it off the ground. It was a really great team of people, smart people, doing the right things, but sometimes incentives are good. If you look around the rest of the world, China is taking off like a rocket because they've got tons of incentives. They get free land and free, a lot of cases, free labor, and a lot of cases, free capital equipment. So people are racing out to build solar factories. In fact, almost every province in China has built a solar factory. And it's because the government was throwing money at it. So you come to the US and they're screaming about how Solyndra got any money at all. And it was really interesting. I got in a bit of a discussion with one of the guys. He was saying, oh, we shouldn't give, this government shouldn't be in business. And I said, well, that's an interesting thought. And he said, we lost $500 million to in the Solyndra disaster. And I said, yeah, but if you think about this hypersonic jet, it lasted, I think the sum total of 2 jets was less than 60 seconds of flight. And it was 380 million sitting at the bottom of the Pacific. So I said, Solyndra lasted more than 60 seconds and those jets didn't. So 2 of them at the bottom of the ocean. So I said, and that's really the cost of the jets. That doesn't mean the cost of all the R&D that went into those jets. It doesn't take into consideration that we've been trying to chase this hypersonic jet program since the 60s. So I said, it's been billions spent on this hypersonic jet, and we still don't have one that flies. 2 at the bottom of the ocean for 380 million, probably billions spent on the program. So when you start to think about it, everybody says, wow, well, we got to spend on defense. It's really critical to us. I say we got to spend on energy because it's critical to us. When you think about, we subsidize food because, it's really critical and we don't want to depend on another country holding us hostage. We have to have our own defense because we can't depend on somebody else to police the world. But we say to ourselves, well, we'll let ourselves be held hostage by other countries because, we want the oil, we want the other forms of energy. I say, my personal opinion is that we subsidize coal, we subsidize oil, we subsidize gas, subsidize other forms of energy, and people are saying we should turn off all the subsidies for renewables. I think it's kind of foolhardy because it's an important piece of our the U.S. economy, and it's very strategic in nature that we don't tie ourselves to some other country and being at the mercy of them and regulating the oil prices. And so I think that my personal opinion is that things like Solyndra, you got to invest, you got to try and see if it flies. Maybe it won't, maybe it will, but that's the way to drive things in innovation. And so I think the U.S. ought to be doing more of this. A lot of people would say keep the U.S. keep the government out of business. I think they should be investing more because the competitors, I told you, we're at 4% solar in the U.S. when we used to be 40%. It all went to China. They went there because they subsidized the heck out of their industries. So, we see manufacturing jobs, and I told you manufacturing is an important piece. You get more downstream jobs from manufacturing than you do the other industries, than service industries and in education industries and these other industries. So I think we really need to do what we can to keep the manufacturing jobs in the U.S., and solar is one of those opportunities where we can do more with solar in the U.S. So what other questions did you guys have? I tried to look through the questions and pick slides that answered most of your questions. Anything else? Go ahead.
Go first.
This may be naive, but why is it that thin film is only at 10%? It seems like it's easier to, everything about it's easier.
So the problem, the thin film guys are not high efficiency. So they work perfect out in the desert. You got land. Land is cheap, so you can build out. So I don't care if let's say I need 100 watts, I can build something this huge, or I can, build it with crystal silicon and something like this, right? But residential rooftop, I can't use thin film because I need 3 houses to power one. I need enough roof area to power one. So thin film doesn't work great because of the efficiency is low. So it really pushes itself to maybe commercial rooftops and solar farms. So First Solar, the leader in thin film, solar farms, that's their big thing. But the crystal silicon guys can play in a lot of different areas. They can go out and play in the desert, in solar farms, they can play on commercial rooftops, they can play on residential rooftops. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. So thin film is struggling in that regard. A lot of people thought thin film would be going faster. And you saw all these solar startups, they were venturing into thin film because they thought there's a lot of opportunity there. So much energy was spent on crystal silicon. The thin film guys really were starting to do a lot of innovative things to get their efficiencies up. And they've really done a great job of getting their efficiencies up. But the efficiency is still not in a place where they can play in a lot of the spaces. They're really relegated to solar farms.
I have some questions about the policies you just mentioned. And I know that still many people in the US are talking about the solar industry in China and government subsidies. And I know it is very encouraging for people around the world to look at the employment created by this industry in China. And but I think that was the case 2 years ago. And now, if you talk about China's solar industry, people in China mostly worry about whether these enterprises can survive. Right. Because we created too many solar enterprises, and we created the so-called China price. And the solar panels price is so low that these enterprises can hardly survive. So in terms of government subsidy in the U.S., I don't know whether you may want to avoid such traps to build too much factories. Right. And the second one is about the economics feasibility of the solar panel. And as you just mentioned, currently about 50% of the cost, end user cost of the solar panels are incurred in the final implementation stage. But I think this is also the place where a lot of jobs are created. Yep. And you also mentioned that currently solar PV is very labor intensive, and we all know that the labor is expensive. But people also say that today these solar PV are not feasible because they are too expensive for many people. And a way to cut costs is to cut labor intensity. So there seems to be some dilemma here. You want more job creation, you want more labor intensive things, then you have to bear a higher cost that it prevents its adoption. Thank you.
So he was talking about the cost of solar in China. It's dropped so significantly, and they built so many factories that they're basically trying to cut each other's throats. And so they're out there trying to undercut each other, and they're selling a lot of it below cost. And so what you see is there's maybe 300 companies that are in solar today around China. Those are going to contract down to a handful of larger companies that can survive this thing. And it's kind of one of the sad things that they drove too fast. And everybody's putting solar factories in without really all knowing what they're doing. And so it was really a shame because they've got this issue where a lot of these companies aren't going to survive the next couple of years. And so he was talking about expanding too quickly. And I would give you that any industry that takes off too rapidly and exceeds the supply-demand curve will end up paying the price for it. And so subsidizing it smartly is the right way to go. So just throwing money at something doesn't help. It's like the desert, right? Too much rain, it just runs off. Too little rain, it's the desert. Just the right amount of rain and things grow, right? So the part of this is that they went a little too fast in China. I would agree. And it caused the market prices to drop crazy. I mean, I can't believe how fast they've been dropping. They're probably going to level off here a little bit, but it's a lot of these companies that jumped into solar in China are not going to survive the next couple of years. And a lot of the larger companies are going in and buying up these factories, buying the equipment out of them and leaving shells behind. So it's a shame. And you were talking about the cost of solar. You're right, a lot of it is in, like I showed you, 50% of it is in the installation piece of it. So they're getting smarter there too. They're getting more clever. One of the big costs there is permitting. So, you know, we have something called the National Electric Code, the NEC. And the National Electric Code, you know, governs how you install different things, electrical gear. But they weren't really good about keeping up with solar and how quickly it turned on. And so this, you know, like Sunnyvale has their rules, and Mountain View has their rules, and Palo Alto has their rules. And if you're a solar installer and you're trying to cover these areas, you run off to this guy and he says, no, no, you got to use this wiring and you got to put this, you know, safety device in. And the other place says, no, I want a different safety device and I want it to run differently. So it's a huge cost for permitting because we weren't on the same page when it comes to this. So that's one of the things. The labor is expensive, but people were, there weren't a lot of people who knew how to install them. So the guys who were installing could take a premium. And so now they're changing this. More and more people are jumping into, you know, solar installations because they see the money in it. So like anything, people will chase the money, and it'll cause the prices to come down on installation as well. The inverter is a big piece of the cost, and they're getting smarter about inverters as well, and the lifetimes of inverters. Somebody sent in a question last night, what's the lifetime of solar? So typically, most solar manufacturers assume that they have to have a lifetime of more than 20 years. So the panel's got to be viable for 20 years, it's got to produce. There will be some degradation of efficiency over time, but they recognize that, and that but the panel actually has to survive 20 years. So they've got panels now that with an accelerated lifetime testing that they're showing, you know, 30 years of life. It's different companies. So I was trying to think of some of the other questions you guys were asking about last night. You mentioned this book, something about what would I do?
What I wish I knew when I was 20.
Yeah, that's a good. I was laughing about that when I was awake at 2:30 in the morning thinking about this book and how to answer this question. And so I was thinking that judgment, that's the best thing, I think. You know, when I was younger, I didn't have good judgment. So it was really interesting. They talked about, I remember when, 4 years ago when Obama was running for office, they said, well, he's too young. And McCain was the seasoned veteran. He knew what he was doing, all this. And so he turned it on this, the argument around, and he said, it's about judgment. It's not about, you know, how many years you've been on the planet or how much years of experience you have. It's really about good judgment. So there are people who make great judgment, you know, early in their career, and others that have to learn the lesson many times before they finally get the judgment. So I'd say that, you know, what I wish I knew when I was 20 was just better judgment. You know, not to speed on the freeway, you know, not to go drinking too much at night, you know, this kind of stuff. Little simple things you think are kind of silly, but that's judgment. In my career, you know, when to walk away from a job and when to stick it out. When to let my emotions show and when not to let your emotions show. These are things where it's just judgment. And I think some people catch it real quickly. There's people who have great judgment early on, and there's others who struggle their whole life with figuring out what good judgment is, you know? And so I think if I had to say it one thing, that when to know what to do right and you know, when to do it, it's about judgment. I was thinking about, you know, that fly that buzzes against the window, bzz, 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 and he never gets through the window, right? And at some point you have to say, you know, how long before I give up? I'm not going to get through this window. You know, a lot of flies are dead on the windowsill in my garage. I was thinking about this. And so, but there's other times where you need to think about good judgment then, you know, when to turn around and give up. And there are other times when I persevered in things in my career and in my marriage, in life, all types of things. I persevered and it paid off in the end. So sometimes you got to know when to give up, and sometimes you got to know when to keep going. And that's just judgment. It just comes with figuring it out. And so I don't know. I don't know if the book talks about that, but that's what I would say is the stuff that I wish I knew then. That and what stuff to invest in probably is another one. So what other questions did you guys have?
Last question. We end in about 1 minute. Okay, excellent.
Can you maybe talk about the life cycle of the solar cell, and have people started thinking of ways to recycle these, like at the end of the 20-year lifetime?
Yeah, it's a big thing that people are discussing now. The CAD-TEL people, cadmium is obviously a dangerous material. You can't breathe it, can't ingest it. So people are worried about it. Gallium arsenide, people are concerned about this. And so there's a lot of studies being done, a lot of work being done on how to recycle these when it's time. And some of the stuff that has failed early, they're looking at how to capture it. The selenium becomes an issue when when selenium hits moisture, it can produce hydrogen selenide. It's a poisonous gas. And so there's a lot of this that goes into these different types of solar panels. And so there's a big market kicking into gear on how to deal with it down the road, because they're just starting to see some of the really old stuff and some of the early failures of things, how to recycle that. So I told you, one of the big costs in the solar is silver paste. They put this silver paste down, they screen print it. And that silver paste, how do you collect that silver back? Because it's valuable. So people are looking at this sort of thing. So there's a market growing on it. I don't know much more about it than I read the trade journals and this kind of stuff, and I see people talking about it. There's articles on it more and more every day. So thank you for your time, guys.